Shalom, shalom, peace and blessings. Now let's get straight into it. Now today we're going to be diving back into Daniel chapter 11. This time we're going to be doing around verse 4 to around verse 10. So we covered Daniel chapter 11 verses 1 through 3 in the previous lesson. So definitely check that out already. But check that out if you haven't already. Now, I really love covering the historic aspect of the scriptures, like what we see covered in Daniel chapter 11, because I truly believe it's important to understand our history. All right. And, unfortunately, I see a lot of brothers and sisters that just do not want to deal with the historic aspect of the scriptures. But I think it's important because it builds on the spiritual aspect of the scriptures too, because you're able to build your faith knowing that the Most High was able to prophesy all of these events hundreds of years before they happen, right? So it just validates more of our views and more of our beliefs. And when I say beliefs, take that loosely. Of course, we know that this is truth, but speaking of, let me grab this verse here. Let's get Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 10. Let's start at verse 9. Remember the former things of old. That's what we're doing now. For I am the Most High, and there is none else. I am the Most High, and there is none like me. I agree with this verse. There is none like the Most High. Okay, no other book like the Quran or Book of Mormon or whatever the case has not been able to 100% accurately prophesy events and be 100% accurate all throughout thousands and thousands of years of history like the scriptures have. And only the Most High can do that. All right, He's the only God. All right, that's it. There is no other deity there. All right, there is no other power. I know the quote unquote Old Testament only, or really the people that don't believe in Christ, they kind of quote this verse or verses like this to say that Christ don't exist, but that's not what this is saying. Anyway, verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. So the Most High declared the end from the beginning, in the ancient times, the things that are not yet done. So at the time that the book of Daniel was written, these things had not been done yet. All right. And we know that even in the quote unquote Old Testament, there's prophecies that have not been fulfilled yet. All throughout the scriptures, it's really some still in the Torah and the first 5 books of the Bible that have not been fulfilled yet. So this is how the Most High works, man. And this is just a testimony of the Most High being all knowing and all powerful. So as I read through chapters like Daniel chapter 11, these are the things that I'm keeping in mind. So it's relevant for us to understand these things and go into the history and see, how these accounts check out from what was written in the scriptures. So let's get it. All right. So I'm going to start at verse 4. Since we covered the other verses already, it says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. So we know that verse 3 was talking about Alexander the Greek, and verse 4 is too. So I have these notes up here for Daniel chapter 11. Once I'm finished through the entire chapter, I'll make this available and put it in the description, just in case brothers and sisters want to add what I have onto their notes and look into the accounts themselves and things of that nature. So right here it says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven. The he there is Alexander the Freak. It's funny how they call these Greek and Roman generals the Great and Theos and all of these things. Nicator, all of these things, and when you look and see what works say, the things they were into, it kind of shows you what this society prioritizes, that they still let these names be known. It's kind of like calling, Jeffrey Dahmer the Great or something. But anyway, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. So the he there that his kingdom was broken up was Alexander the Greek, and then the four winds of heaven was referring to Alexander's four generals, aka the Diadochi. And Diadochi just means successors. So you had this war called the Wars of the Diadochi. Now, in the Wars of the Diadochi, the wars, it says here in this Wikipedia page, the wars of Alexander's successors were a series of conflicts that were fought between the generals of Alexander the Great, known as the Diadochi, over who would rule his empire following his death. The fighting occurred between 322 and 281 BC. So, just to gain the land that Alexander was able to, conquer in the land that he had during his reign before he died, basically these four generals were fighting over who was going to take what. So that's how this works here. Or that's how this went down. So you have Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Those are the four generals. Okay, now Ptolemy, he was Pharaoh of Egypt. All right, from 305 to 304 BC to 282 BC. Cassander was king of Macedonia for that short period of time of 305 to 297 BC. Lysimachus was king over Thrace, Asia Minor, and Macedon as well from 288 to 281 BC. And then you have Seleucus the First, Nicator, which he began his reign over Syria, most of the former Achaemenid Empire, and then Babylon. So what we're going to see is that mainly these wars came down to to Ptolemy and Seleucus, who the scriptures call the kings of the south, being Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and also the kings of the north, or who the scriptures call the kings of the north, but what we know in history as the Seleucids or the Seleucid Empire. Okay, those were the main conflicts against these two generals here and their descendants, fighting for land and fighting for power. That's how everybody got down in this time. It's really still like that right now, but they just don't tell you that outright. They try to act like they go and fight wars because, somebody in another country was oppressing people and they got mad, so they wanted to fight about it. No, everything that this society does or this country, all for the same reasons: for resources, for money, and for land, and for power. That's what it's always been about. That's what it's always going to be about. Okay. But anyways, let's go back to it here. It says, we covered the four generals there. And now the part that says in verse 4, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. When it says not to his posterity, it's referring to Alexander's kingdom was not given to his descendants. So Alexander, when he died, he left over, he really didn't have, that many descendants at all anyways, but he had 2 wives. He probably hated that. But he had Statira, one of the daughters that defeated Persian Emperor Darius, and then Roxanne. So both of his wives ended up dying. He had a mentally disabled brother, Philip Aridas. He ended up dying. Okay, who else? You had his mother. She ended up dying. I mean, his whole, anyone that was attached to him, Alexander's line was completely extinguished 14 years after his death. So that you see his land that he conquered while he was alive, he being Alexander, was not given to his son, wasn't given to his wives, wasn't given to anyone that was related to him, any of his roots. It was given to his 4 generals. Okay, that's what it means there, not according to his posterity, here in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 4. Okay, brothers and sisters can kind of read over this if they want to. I didn't want to bog down a lesson with unnecessary details, but pretty much what happened, you had Cassander, which took control of Alexander the Fourth, or Alexander the Greek, his son. Eurydice, again, they all were killed. So, we could look over that, but point is already there. Not to his posterity. So Alexander the Great, or the Greek, or the Macedonian, or the freak, none of his kingdom was, when it was broken, it wasn't given to his posterity. So nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. So it was plucked up, it was destroyed, or broken. Well, it wasn't really destroyed, but it was broken down into the 4 generals, the Diadochi. Okay, and they engaged in these wars, the 4 generals. And really more than that, but the main 4 generals are the ones that took over most land. They engaged in these wars to see who was going to get what. Okay, because Alexander ruled all of this before he died. All right, so basically, they were fighting to see who was going to take what. All right, and again, Ptolemy the First, he was the king of the south in the scriptures. All right, he ended up being Pharaoh in Egypt. These Kemet guys, the ones that believe that we so-called black people are ancient Egyptians, they don't seem to mention this period in history where a so-called white man was ruling in Egypt. I mean, I ain't tripping. I ain't saying like that never happened to our people in Israel. I'm just saying they don't seem to bring this up. Or maybe they do and I don't see it or something. But anyways, it says Ptolemy the First, Ptolemy the Savior. That's what Soter means, the Savior. All right. Was a Macedonian Greek general, historian, and bodyguard of Alexander the Great. Originally from the kingdom of Macedon in northern Greece, he went on to become ruler in Egypt, then part of Alexander's former empire. Ptolemy was pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt from 305 to 304 to his death. He was the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, turning the country into a Hellenistic kingdom and Alexandria into a center of Greek culture. So another thing that was going on at this time was a lot of the world was being Hellenized. What does Hellenized mean? Essentially, all of the Greek customs, they were being spread across a lot of the known world. So the language, the Greek language, a lot of the, their fashions, the way that they did things, the gods that they worshiped, all those things were being spread all across the known world. So that's why by the time in the first century, you already had, you know, all the people, in Israel and the surrounding areas where the northern kingdom was scattered. You had them, taking on Greek customs. Okay. And that was one of the main languages at that time, Koine Greek. That's exactly why, because Alexander's four generals, when they conquered all this land, they made all their subjects pretty much, take on the Greek customs at that time. All right. And then a little bit later on, towards the end of this, you had the Romans come in that started to conquer, which a lot of their customs are pretty much the same. All right. Just degeneracy, essentially. So this is Seleucus. So, by the way, when you see Seleucus, remember this is the king of the north, because the Seleucid Empire, they mainly took over Syria. And you had, of course, Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, but they were mainly in Syria. And when you see the king of the north, king of the south, that's in proximity to Israel. So Syria is north to Israel, and then Egypt is south to Israel. So that's why you have these names, because, of course, in the scriptures, everything is based on the children of Israel. And also with Seleucus and the Ptolemies, we're going to see later on in the book of Maccabees how this really affected our people. And this is why, the prophet Daniel was given this prophecy in the first place, because this all comes down to how the children of Israel were oppressed and, a part of our history. And that's why the scriptures go into, detail of the Seleucid Empire and the Syrian wars. Speaking of the Syrian wars, let's go into that really quickly too. So this is what I was telling you guys as far as the wars between the quote unquote king of the north and king of the south. So it says the Syrian wars in this Wikipedia entry here were a series of 6 wars between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, successor states to Alexander the Great's empire during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC over the region called Syria, one of the few avenues into Egypt. These conflicts strained the material and manpower of both parties and led to the eventual destruction and conquest by Rome and Parthia. They are briefly mentioned in the biblical books of the Maccabees. So we had the Syrian wars are chronicled in the scriptures, and the Syrian wars essentially led to the conquest of Rome, because we know by the time that Christ was on the scene that the Romans were actually in charge, or they were in rulership. The Romans were, not the Greeks. So we're looking at the Greek rulership right now, which was coming into an end after Alexander the Great died. All right. So one thing too, just to go over this. Now, when you see Ptolemy and all of the different commanders and leaders, or the kings or the descendants of Ptolemy the First, when you see Ptolemy, no, it's the kings of the south, or the Egyptian, or the Ptolemaic dynasty, or the Ptolemaic kings. Okay, so Ptolemy, Egypt. And I'm going over this in this fashion because there's a lot of names. So as we're going through this, it could be confusing, or maybe it's just me. I know when I first went through this, it was a lot. And then just kind of re-going over this again, honestly, I had to get reacquainted with the names and the different dynasties. So when you see Ptolemy, that those are the kings of Egypt. So you see Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. We about to go over that in a second. What is Philadelphus? What does that mean? All right. And then Ptolemy III, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, Cleopatra. And then when you see Antiochus, know that this is the Seleucid Empire. So Antiochus the first, Soter, or any of the Antiochus lines, they were named after Antioch, which was in Syria. So You have Antiochus, and also you will just see Seleucus. So like Seleucus the first, which was the first general over the Seleucid Empire, and his son was actually Antiochus the first. So just so you don't get confused there, just remember when you see Antiochus, that's still the Seleucid Empire. Okay. So Antiochus, Antigonus, Seleucus, Antiochus, and then you go to Philip the fifth, Antiochus the fourth. Now Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, we're gonna read about him in the First Maccabees chapter 1. Okay, let's keep in mind that was a Seleucid king. All right, a Greek king from the Seleucid Empire. So Antiochus, Seleucids, Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was in Egypt, mainly at least. They had more land than that, but mainly in Egypt. Okay. And as we're going through this, you're going to see why I took time to kind of verify that just as I'm going through this, so it'll make more sense to brothers and sisters. So yeah, let's keep going. I took a lot of time there just to divide some things, but let's keep going in the chapter. So I believe that's all we needed in verse 4. Yep, let's go to verse 5 now. All right, so Daniel chapter 11, verse 5 says, "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion." So the king of the south, as we went over, is referring to Ptolemy the first, which was one of Alexander's generals. And, again, soda means savior. So sometimes I say soda just so you guys know who I'm referring to, but he ain't my savior. All right. So yeah, Ptolemy the first, and he was the king of the south that shall be strong. And one of his princes is referring to Seleucus the first, or the kings of the north, which was part of the Seleucid Empire. So that's one of his princes, because when it says one of his princes, this can read as one of the princes of the king of the south, but it's still going back to Alexander, one of his princes. Okay, so one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. This is referring to Seleucus the first. So the Seleucid Empire was a strong dominion. Matter of fact, they ended up winning the Syrian wars. So they actually won over the Ptolemaic dynasty, or the Ptolemaic Empire, and they had the most land, really. See, if you look here, this is kind of a even more simple breakdown. So you see how much land Seleucus had. All right. So it was a strong empire and a strong dominion. So that's why it says that here, his dominion shall be a great dominion. It was a great dominion. Great meaning, in power and in influence, or in how much land they had conquered. So I believe that's all we needed in verse 5. Yeah, let's join. Let's join. Let's go down to verse 6 here. It says, "And in the end of the years, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm. Neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up. And they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times." So let's break this all the way down here. Now it says, and in the end of the years, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So now what we're seeing here is the descendants of Ptolemy the first and Seleucus the first. We're starting to see their descendants now. The scriptures are going to their descendants and not, not the original men. So when you see the kings of the south and kings of the north, it could be referring to either the original kings of north and south, or Ptolemy and Seleucus, respectfully, could be referring to them, or it could be referring to their descendants. Because right now, when it says they shall join themselves together, this is referring to Ptolemy Philadelphus and Antiochus II, so-called Theos. And I put so-called because Theos means God in Greek. Dang sure ain't my God. So, this is little surnames they have. So if I say them, I'm only saying that so we know who they are in history. But they made an alliance in 253 BC. And we're about to see why in just a second. So Ptolemy Philadelphus, that was Ptolemy the first. That was his son. So let's go to Ptolemy the second here, Philadelphus. So it says Ptolemy the second, Philadelphus. And look what it says here, because I wanna go into this briefly. It says Philadelphus, Ptolemaeus, Philadelphus, Ptolemy, sibling lover. Why does it say sibling lover? Also known after his death as Ptolemy the Great. Okay. Again, they the ones that call these sibling lovers the Great. That's kind of wild. But I want to go into this for a second. So, the name Philadelphus, it looks very similar to Philadelphia, right? And we know that Philadelphia, they just went to the Super Bowl. So, I said, or the Philadelphia Eagles of the NFL team of the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and went to the Super Bowl. So I say, you know what? I'll just go into this for a brief second, just in case brothers and sisters didn't know. So it says the shocking true origin of the name Philadelphia. It says here in this article, which we could have just gotten this, but I like to have the words on screen formatted in a certain way. But it says, you've all been taught the name Philadelphia comes from the Greek meaning city of brotherly love. So we know that that's what Philadelphia is called, the city of brotherly love. Let's get more on that, though. It says that's mostly true. What you haven't been taught is alone fascinating. That's an interesting word to use there. History behind the name. As it turns out, the name Philadelphia ultimately comes from a nickname given to an ancient Greek ruler of Egypt who gained notoriety by marrying his own full sister. The brotherly love in the name originally referred to literal incest. So when you see, the city of brotherly love, that is literal. I truly believe that's why you have the city of Philadelphia. You have a lot of our people there. When I say our people, the so-called blacks that live there, that, they kind of in a certain position over there in Philadelphia. And I truly believe it's because in that name itself, there's a curse in that. All right. Names and words, when the etymology of those words, they have, a certain vibration. You have to be careful. Like, words are just words, but at the same time, would you name your child Death? Or even something like ugly? Would you name them that? No, you want to, name them a name that actually means something, or, it's not, the etymology comes down to incest or something. So yeah, Ptolemy the second, it says Ptolemy the second was an ancient Greek king who ruled Egypt from March 282 BC to January 246 BC. So this is what we are going into now. So Ptolemy II, he married his sister Arsinoe II. Okay. Now, it says marriages between siblings were normal for the Egyptian pharaohs, so Ptolemy II's native Egyptian subjects weren't terribly surprised. Yeah, that that's something else. So that was common between them. That's just how they got down. And just so you guys understand, that's why we have so many different things going on in this society. Because let's get verse 3 really quickly. In Revelation chapter 13, it says, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So this beast is referring to the last kingdom mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, which was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would be healed, meaning all of the doctrines and the philosophies and the customs of the Greeks and the Romans have now been healed, meaning they've now been put back on earth. And that deadly wound was healed because they went out of power when so-called blacks ruled during the Middle Ages, from around the time of 476 all the way up to like the 1800s. But we started to started to lose rulership around 1,000 years, around the time of the Renaissance. But yeah, all these doctrines are now back on earth. That's why you see transgenderism being a priority, homosexuality being a priority, and eventually incest, pedophilia. These things are more than likely going to take its course in the planet Earth as well. And I wanted to grab this. Let's get Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 16. "Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." Verse 17, "For you know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears." So Esau, man, he just got a knack for going off because there's no other fornicator. And fornicator, what we know here, like in the Greek word porneia, just means sexually immoral acts. So fornication is not quote unquote sex before marriage. It's really incest, bestiality, pedophilia, homosexuality, transgenderism, so on and so forth. That's fornication. Okay. And Esau, he knows all about it. Okay. I think it was in Who is Esau lesson 3 that I did. I went into a lot of how Esau been fornicating, been inbreeding, and still doing it right now. Now, I'm not saying they're the first ones, because the ancient Egyptians, they used to go off too. And that's where a lot of, Esau got this from, especially like in this Ptolemaic dynasty. They went down there in Egypt and learned a lot of their customs down there in Kemet. But Esau just be doing it, just for the heck of it. We know that in the Egyptian cultures, they have different ritualistic practices. Not saying that makes it any better or anything like that. But point is, they all be going off, but none like Esau, man. So that's nothing to him to be going off. All right. Malachi 1 and 4. "Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever." This is referring to the so-called white man, and we see why. No, I'm not saying the average so-called white man that live down your street or your neighbor or your coworker or anything like that is inbred, or he or she is marrying their brother or sister. I'm not saying that, but overall as a people, the so-called elite, These are the things that they really believe in. Okay. I know I'm taking one example here of Ptolemy II, but I'm just relating it to what's going on today here in the world. That's exactly why you have so much fornication or so much wickedness being put like it's innocent. All right. It's because these are the ideologies that these people actually believe in. And once you understand that, you'll understand why everything is done the way that it's done in this world. But anyways, back to the scriptures here, at least the chapter. It says here, they shall join themselves together. The king of the south is Ptolemy Philadelphus, or Ptolemy the incestor. That's what his name should have been, Ptolemy Incest. King's daughter of the south, that would be Berenice. She was queen of Syria. So Berenice and the king of the north, or Antiochus II, they made an alliance or an agreement in 253 BC. So the king's daughter of the south, which is Berenice, married Antiochus II. Okay, see if we can get some history on that. And this was to stop war, by the way. The reason that they made that alliance. Okay, not Antiochus II. I mean the first. Let's get Philadelphus, or Ptolemy Incest. Ptolemy the incestor. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so what we're reading about essentially in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 6 is going to be the Second Syrian War. So it says here in the Second Syrian War, this is the Wikipedia entry for Ptolemy II, the incestor. Around 260 BC, war broke out once more between Ptolemy II and the Seleucid realm, now ruled by Antiochus II. So Antiochus II was the king of the north, mentioned in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 6. Okay. The cause of the war seems to have been the two kings competing realms. Seleucid claims to the cities of Western Asia Minor, particularly Miletus and Ephesus. Its outbreak seems to be connected to the revolt of Ptolemy II's co-regent Ptolemy, who had been leading the Ptolemaic naval forces against Antagonus II. Okay, so we can kind of see some of the wars here in between the Second Syrian War, but for the sake of the actual verse in Daniel chapter 11, verse 6, let's read this. It says, in 253 BC, Ptolemy negotiated a peace treaty in which he conceded large amounts of territory in Asia Minor to Antiochus. The peace was sealed by Antiochus's marriage to Ptolemy's daughter, Berenice, which took place in 252 BC. Ptolemy presented large indemnity payments to the Seleucids as a dowry connected to this wedding. After the war was over, in July 256 BC, Ptolemy traveled to Memphis, so that's in Egypt. There he rewarded his soldiers by distributing large plots of land that had been reclaimed from Lake Moeris in the Fayum to them as estates. The area was established as a new nome named the Arsinoe nome in honor of the long dead Arsinoe II. So point is that the king of the south, or Ptolemy II, his daughter was Berenice, and they came to an agreement to end the war by Antiochus II, or the king of the north, marrying Berenice. Now you will see this many times in wars where, the king or the general's daughter was used as a peace treaty to give to the other side's, a king or general, what have you. All right. Kind of like in the Trojan War, if you watch the movie Troy, or you just read the Iliad and know the account, where you had, pretty much the same situation, or the war was over a daughter. But anyways, let's keep going. Now it says in verse 6 as well, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up. And they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. When it says shall not retain the power of the arm, Berenice was killed and did not retain her power as queen, and the power gained through the alliance after only 7 years. So she did not retain the power of the arm because Berenice was actually killed. Okay. So in 246, this is the Wikipedia entry for Berenice. So Berenice, which was the daughter of Ptolemy II. Okay. So it says in 246 BC, when Ptolemy died, Ptolemy II, Antiochus II took up again his first wife, Laodice. Antiochus died shortly thereafter, many suspect from poisoning. Queen Berenice claimed the regency of her infant son, Antiochus. However, she and her son were both killed by Laodice. So Laodice was Antiochus II, his first wife. So he had to divorce his first wife, Laodice, to take on the king of the south's daughter, Berenice. But when that happened, Laodice got vindictive, of course, and she got Berenice and her son. And her son, the Antiochus, he was pretty young at the time. Okay. So they both were killed by Laodice, which was the first wife. Hopefully that's not too confusing. If so, just keep going back over this until you get it. All right, it says Berenice's brother, we about to get into Ptolemy III. All right, succeeded their father and set about to avenge his sister's murder by invading Syria and having Laodice killed. This is also mentioned in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 6. So you see, history is connected right now. So everything mentioned in the scriptures actually went down the way that the Most High, had his angel prophesying to Daniel, how the angel said it was going to go down. Okay, so in this verse it says, neither shall he stand. That's Antiochus II. He died shortly after Ptolemy Philadelphus died. Thought to be poisoned by Laodice too, see? Nor his arm, Antiochus' strength and power of the alliance did not stand. She shall be given up. So Berenice was killed by Laodice. Okay, so Antiochus' first wife, they divorced and married Berenice. They that brought her, so Berenice was killed and those that were with her, and he that begat her, so Ptolemy Philadelphus died as well. So remember, Ptolemy II, which is Ptolemy I's son, the ancestor, that's the king of the south, that was given, he gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II, and this is what we're going into. Just go over it again. And also her infant son was killed, meaning Berenice, her son Antiochus, which is different from the Antiochus that we're referring to in this verse, of course. It says he that strengthened her. So this is either referring to Ptolemy Philadelphus or her son, because both of those were killed. Both of them were killed. So that's all of the verse there. In verse 6, the end of the years, they shall join themselves together. That's referring to Ptolemy II and Antiochus II. For the king's daughter of the south, Berenice, shall come to the king of the north, Antiochus II, to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm. And when you see the arm in the scriptures, at least in this context, is referring to the strength. All right, the power of the arm, their rulership. All right, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, or his power, or his strength, but she shall be given up. Berenice was given up, she was killed, And they that brought her, those that brought her with her, and he that begat her. So Ptolemy II, he was killed too. And he that strengthened her in these times. Okay. So let's go to verse 7. It says, but out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Now, verse 7, it says, but of her roots shall one stand. That's referring to Berenice's brother, which was Ptolemy III. Okay, so let's get a little bit on Ptolemy III. Okay, so Ptolemy III, this was Berenice's brother. So Ptolemy Euergetes, or Ptolemy the benefactor, was the third pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt from 246 to 222 BC. The Ptolemaic kingdom reached the height of its military and economic power during his kingship, as initiated by his father, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Ptolemy III was the eldest son of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe I. All right. So, they had these little incest babies. All right, these Ptolemies did. But essentially here, what we're going into is one of her roots that's referring back to Berenice, because remember the topic in her in verse 6 was Berenice. So, but out of a branch of her roots, Berenice's roots, which was Ptolemy the third Euergetes, or Euergetes again means the benefactor, so just Ptolemy the third for short, shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. So when it says which shall come with an army, Ptolemy III came out of Egypt and invaded Syria in the Third Syrian War to avenge his sister and nephew's death. So remember we talked about how Berenice and his son was killed? Well, Ptolemy III, he came out of Egypt with an army to invade Syria, because we know that Berenice was killed by Laodice. Laodice was the first wife of the king of the north. So he was going to avenge his sister's death and his nephew. So Syria is the fortress of the king of the north. Ptolemy III succeeded, so he won in this Third Syrian War. Okay. And let's keep going. Or matter of fact, it says, enter the fortress of the king of the north that shall deal against him and shall prevail. Yeah, we're going to get more on that in just a second. Now it says in verse 8, let's get that. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Now, what does that mean? So, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and gold. So this is referring to, go back to Ptolemy III. So Ptolemy III, when he went and came out of Egypt into Syria and won that war, the Third Syrian War, he actually took back a ton of gold and silver and idols with him. So let's see. Let's go here to this account. All right. It says here, Third Syrian War. In July 246 BC, Antiochus II, king of the Seleucid Empire, died suddenly by his first wife, Laodice. Antiochus II had a son, Seleucus II, who was about 19 years old in 246 BC. However, in 253 BC, he had agreed to repudiate Laodice and marry Ptolemy III's sister, Berenice. Antiochus II and Berenice had a son named Antiochus, who was still an infant when his father died. A succession dispute broke out immediately after Antiochus II's death. Ptolemy III quickly invaded Syria in support of his sister and her son, marking the beginning of the Third Syrian War, also known as the Laodicean War. An account of the initial phase of this war, written by Ptolemy III himself, is preserved on a Guru papyrus. So, a lot of these accounts, man, has archaeology behind it. So that immediately completely validates the scriptures. All right. This was not written, the book of Daniel chapter 11 was not written after they found, this archaeology, the Guru papyrus. All right. And they actually had accounts written from Ptolemy III to himself. So this wasn't written afterwards. So this had to be prophesied before time. All right. I'm not saying that's the only way they would have known by finding this account, but I'm just saying that it was prophesied before time, hundreds of years before. That's where I'm getting at. So at the outbreak of war, Laodicea I and Seleucus II were based in Western Asia Minor, while the widowed Queen Berenice was in Antioch. The latter quickly seized control of Cilicia to prevent Laodicea I from entering Syria. Meanwhile, Ptolemy III marched along the Levantine coast, encountering minimal resistance. So this is what we were reading about. The cities of Seleucia and Antioch surrendered to him without a fight in late autumn. At Antioch, Ptolemy III went to the royal palace to plan his moves with Berenice in person, only to discover that she and her young son had been murdered. Okay. So that's exactly what happened there. Now to get into the gold and silver. Okay, so let's talk about the silver and the precious vessel of gold that was mentioned in the verse in verse 8. So it says, Jerome says, and the name of this book, by the way, is Egypt as Seen in Scripture and on the Monuments. So it says here, Jerome says that Ptolemy took with him on his return 40,000 talents of silver, a vast number of precious vessels of gold, and images to the number of 2,400, among which were many of the Egyptian idols, which Cambyses, on his conquering Egypt, had carried into Persia. Ptolemy restored these to the temple to which they belonged, and by this he much endeared himself to his people. It was on account of the service which he thus rendered to his country that he was called Euergetes, that is, the benefactor. So that's how Ptolemy III got his name. Okay, so he carried back idols in silver and gold back to Egypt that was taken when Cambyses conquered Egypt. All right, so he, again, Ptolemy III, this is an Egyptian king or conqueror. When he went to Syria, or when he went to Persia, which is part of the kings of the North territory, when he went and won that Third Syrian War, he carried back idols of silver and gold. So that's what Daniel chapter 11, verse 8 is in reference to. Okay, and then it also says that, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Ptolemy III outlived Seleucus II. That was the king of the north at the time. So that's who, that's who Ptolemy III, that's who he was fighting over. That's the opposing general on the other side, Seleucus II. I told you all these names sometimes it can get a bit blended up, but with diligent study, you definitely can, you definitely can make sense of it. All right, so that was in the Third Syrian War. Seleucus II, again, he was the king of the north, or he was the ruler at the time where Ptolemy III went in and invaded. Okay, That's why it says defeat in the Third Syrian War in Anatolia, because he was defeated. All right, matter of fact, here too is another account of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 8. It says, Ptolemy III returned to Egypt in 245 BC, reputedly taking with him 40 talents of gold and statues of Egyptian gods, which had been looted centuries before by the Persians. Okay, so that's what verse 8 is in reference to. Now let's get verse 9. Daniel chapter 11, verse 9 says, So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. We read that already too. So Ptolemy III came into the kingdom of Seleucus II, Callinicus, but was forced to go back into Egypt due to revolts. When it says here, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, it's referring to Ptolemy III going into Syria, going to the kingdom of Seleucus II. But he had to return back to Egypt because the people were revolting. You saw that many times where you had different revolts going on due to taxes and different things that were levied against the people. They would try to revolt against the rulership there. Okay, so let's go back to Ptolemy III. Okay, so it says here, at this point, however, Ptolemy III received notice that a revolt had broken out in Egypt, and he was forced to return home to suppress it. That's the king of the south that had to return to his own land. Get it? All right, so that's what the scriptures are referring to. By July 245 BC, the Seleucids had recaptured Mesopotamia. The Egyptian revolt is significant as the first of a series of native Egyptian uprisings which would trouble Egypt for the next century. One reason for this revolt was the heavy tax burdens placed on the people of Egypt by Ptolemy III's war in Syria. So, anytime you have war, you gotta pay for that war, right? Pay for all the different materials that the soldiers need. All right, the horses and whatever you need to make the war happen, and the different weapons, so on and so forth. So where you get the money from, you just tax the people. All right, and they were tired of heavy tax burdens over there in Egypt, man. So it led to a lot of revolts. Now, speaking of horses or things of that nature, is crazy, man. Over in Syria, they used to have war elephants, man. If y'all didn't know, like in the movie 300, they had like a more mythological turn on it. But man, they had elephants out there. They're pretty much like tanks. I'm about to read that in a second. Well, that was pretty much verse 9. So I think we're almost wrapping up here. Let's go to verse 10, because that's all we're going to cover on this portion. It says, But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come, and overflow, and pass through. Then he shall return, and be stirred up, even to his fortress. So where it says, and his son shall be stirred up, Seleucus II had two sons, Alexander, aka Seleucus III, and then Antiochus III, which was called the Great. Those were his two sons, meaning the king of the north, his two sons. All right. And shall be stirred up. Seleucus III, Antiochus III were compelled to finish their father Seleucus II's war with Egypt. Okay. And it says, shall assemble a multitude of great forces, the fourth Syrian war, to take possessions back. One shall certainly come. Antiochus III was the one, since Seleucus the third, he died after only a 2-year reign. All right, and I think, matter of fact, I think we're about to go ahead and wrap this up. I don't want to go over too much at one time because, as you see, in this history, it gets a little detailed. It could be a lot more that we can go into because, honestly, I'm cutting a lot of corners here just to keep it relevant to the verses, but it can get a little bit detailed. So it kind of break it down, make it more digestible for brothers and sisters. I think we're about to get close to wrapping it up. But I did want to go over those war elephants that I was talking about. And overflowing passed through Antiochus III, passing through Syria with the multitude. And it says, and he shall return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Antiochus returned to Antioch after defeat, but returned afterwards and took Syria. So the fortress is Raphia. So all of that went down in the Battle of Raphia. Okay. Let's go into these battle elephants, man. It says archaeologists here in this article discover ancient fortress was used to guard port that sent elephants to war. So look at all that. That's archaeology. Essentially, it says a 2,300-year-old fortress and associated structures which protected an ancient port called Berenike have been discovered in Egypt by the Red Sea. This photo shows a fragment of the northern defensive wall of Berenike uncovered in the 2013 season. It says an ancient fortress that protected a Red Sea port which sent elephants to war has been discovered in Egypt by Polish archaeologists. The huge 2,300-year-old fortification at a port called Berenike was built when Egypt was ruled by a dynasty of pharaohs descended from Alexander the Great, known as the Ptolemies. In an ancient rubbish dump by the north defensive wall, among other valuable items, the archaeologists found the remains of an elephant skull. So, man, if you look here, man, these suckers used to have elephants. And again, it says here in ancient times, elephants were considered the tanks of the day, being able to trample enemies and create fear and havoc with their size. So, man, it was it's kind of wild. So it says here during the Battle of Raphia, which took place around 217 BC and saw the Ptolemies pitted against the Seleucid dynasty, both sides had tens of thousands of troops, cavalry, and war elephants. But whereas the Seleucids had access to elephants from India, the Ptolemies didn't and instead set up outposts, such as at the Red Sea, from where they could import African elephants. So they had elephants out there doing war, man. It's crazy. And that was around the Fourth Syrian War. We're going to get into that. We're going to finish up verse 10 a little bit later on. And we're going to finish up the rest of the chapter. We'll probably do another 5 to 10 verses or possibly even more in the next lesson until we get all the way down. So, yeah, that's it for now. I hope this was edifying or at least gave brothers and sisters some sources to kind of look up and research on their own time. We'll be back with part 4. But for now, I bid everyone a mighty shalom.